Well, class, just got home from a long meeting in Chapel Hill today. I did have a chance to read all of your posts, and of course, I graded your assignments for last week, as you already know. Rather than write a whole bunch of responses on the discussion board, which I didn't have time for because I was busy with other things in the last day or so, I thought I would make this video and just make a couple of comments that were on my mind regarding the paper that you read that I had published in the Howard Journal, along with a friend of mine named Matt D. Michelle. That article, probation and parole, overworked, misunderstood, etc. I get a lot of citations on that article. People seem to be very interested in it. And some of you mentioned, and this is what I wanted to talk about, but some of you mentioned quite a bit about the Justice Reinvestment Act that North Carolina and many states have adopted. And in fact, I hear U.S. Senator Thom Tillis often brag about how North Carolina has implemented the Justice Reinvestment Act, and it's a smart way to deal with crime and a smart way to deal with imprisonment. In other words, divert money and put fewer people behind bars and reform people, etc., etc. The idea is a great idea, really. And politicians implemented it, but I'm afraid that many politicians that I know have implemented it for the wrong reason. Many people working in the system and many politicians and many people in the general public still believe, in my opinion, probably way more than half, that offenders can't really be rehabilitated successfully. In spite of that belief, however, we ran into a problem over the last several years, especially in 2008 when the economy took a big downturn and tax revenues were down. The governments of various states, including North Carolina, couldn't continue to expand their prison systems. I mean, they couldn't afford it. It was breaking the bank. Money that could have gone to colleges, parks, local schools, and so on was getting diverted for the burgeoning cost of prisons, which are quite expensive to build and even more expensive to operate. So I think that a lot of people marketed this justice reinvestment as a way to be smarter about crime, and in their hearts perhaps don't really believe it, but what they do know is that they're saving money, which is always important to political people as well. That was one point that I wanted to make. The other point that I wanted to make about that article, which wasn't really mentioned on the discussion board, is that it's a good example of how community corrections in general is evaluated based on anecdotal evidence. So, for example, one case goes bad and one parolee goes bad, and we want to abolish the parole system. Yet, if we look at a larger body of data, and if we do certain things a certain way, we know that we can reduce recidivism by about 10%. Some people say 10 to 30. I'll even say 5%. I'll be very conservative. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, would a 5% reduction in recidivism be worthwhile? And I would flip that around and say a 5% reduction in recidivism means you're 5% safer. So you're enhancing public safety, if you could achieve it. Now, the bad news is that for people released from prison, whether they're on parole or they max out, about 66%, this has been my whole career, the number's consistent, about 66% of the people who get released from prison, whether on parole or just max out of prison, fail within 3 years. For probation, the number I've always read is about 50 to 55% fail within the first year. Those are high failure rates. A lot of people would say, especially with the parole population or the released prisoner population, why would we have such a system? Why would we even pay for it if the failure rate is so high? And then I would take a pause there for a moment and say to people, and in fact I said this once when I was on a blue ribbon panel regarding abolishing parole. It's a Senate panel, state Senate panel. And I said, well, if the failure rate is 66%, and I could get it down 5%, you'd be 5% safer, but the failure rate would still be 61%. That's really high, and you're saying we should abolish parole. Let's use an example from the health system. let's say there's a terrible disease, a form of cancer, and whoever gets this cancer will die within 3 years. And then I come along with a pill that I've invented, and I say, hey, look, I've got this pill, and 5% of you will live who would have otherwise died if you take this pill. Of course, there's a problem. I don't know which of you would be in the 5%, but I do know in aggregate 5% fewer will die. Would it be worth it to sell the pill to you, or would you want the pill? And of course, the answer is going to be yes. In fact, in medicine, when there's a 5% improvement, that's called a medical breakthrough. In criminal justice, nobody calls it anything but a failure. If you have one anecdotal case out of 100 cases that fails, if one case fails out of 100, your goose is cooked, and that's a terrible scenario, really. It's not a good scenario for doing business. In fact, a knee-jerk reaction to one anecdotal failure could cause you not to do the right things in aggregate and then exacerbate the crime problem or exacerbate victimization. Unfortunately, and in fact, we have some people, at least one in probation and parole in our class now, and I'd be curious to know what you think about this, but in my opinion, and I still interact a lot with probation and parole people, they in general don't know how to talk about this in the way that we're talking about it right now. They don't really get into an argument that, you know, this could be analogous to a form of cancer or a disease, and a 5% improvement's a lot better than no improvement. And by the way, the failure rate is high, but maybe that's as good as it gets. Well, if I can get a 10% improvement, even better. But I was going down to 5 and asking, is 5 worth it? 5% fewer homicides, 5% fewer rapes, 5% fewer cars being stolen, and on and on and on. It's a pretty common occurrence. In fact, I've dealt with that a lot in my life. You know, when I was the head of the agency, head of the state parole board, and we were in charge of all community corrections and so on, you had an occasional case go bad. We had one case where a guy went from Atlantic City, actually, a parolee in Atlantic City, one evening, shot his girlfriend in front of the girlfriend's mother and 2 children, stole a car, went over to Philadelphia, shot a few people, went up to New York and shot a few people. He ended up shooting about 12 people. And he himself got shot the next day in Newark on the highway. We got him. But bottom line is that one case almost shut parole down, just as in the example in the article about Connecticut and so on that I was writing about. So it's important that we pay attention to these things and do the right things. Now, of course, what's the right thing? And some people believe there aren't any right things. I happen to believe there are. By the way, I'm not a proponent of no punishment or no control or no law enforcement. I'm not that at all. But I will never lay at punishment's doorstep that which it cannot deliver, which is enhanced public safety. Punishment can deliver a sense of justice, vengeance, revenge, and I'm okay with that. Some people aren't. But it won't deliver rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is the path to public safety. Rehabilitation is not the goal, and I can't tell you how many people I speak to that don't get that. If I go speak to a large group of people, I did recently in Chicago to the probation department, what are we supposed to do? What's our goal? What's our business? And some of them said rehabilitate, some of them said write reports, some of them said do whatever the judge wants you to do, and on and on. And we had a good laugh. But rehabilitation is not the goal. It's a means to an end. And if it's a valid means to an end, then you have to do it, whether you like it or not, whether you like to be helpful to people who did bad things, and so on. And that's what we're called to do in the corrections business. And indeed, in the next chapter, the chapter that you're reading for the week after you were reading the article for week 2, it talks about service organizations and how, it wants to identify who's the customer. And, as you read through the article, think about, as you read through the chapter 3, think about who the customer is. I mean, if the customer is the inmate who's being supervised in the community, or a probationer who's being supervised in the community, or a probationer who's being supervised in the community, then we should acknowledge that, and we should work in a certain way. But we don't just have one customer in criminal justice, or in corrections in particular, since that's what I'm talking about. Another customer would be the general public, right? They have some expectations as well. They're customers. And our life in in our work should be geared around what are we trying to deliver that's valuable to the customers, to the people that are under correctional control of some form, to the offenders that we are watching when we're police and when we're doing prevention in communities and so on. Who's the customer? Think about that as you read chapter 3. I think it's an important point. Okay, I think I've gone on long enough, and consider this my global response to all of your posts for week 2. Thank you very much.